Call to order the regular city council meeting for Tuesday, February 20th, 2024, 5:30 PM. This time I'd ask you all to either put your cell phones on silent or vibrate to limit interruptions. Moving on to item number 1 on the agenda, that's the roll call.
Burlingame.
Here.
Evans. Here. Janser.
Here.
Olson. Here. Pittner.
Here.
Padragula.
Here.
Ross.
Here. Item number 2 is Pledge of Allegiance, and joining us and leading us into the pledge in honor of FFA Week, National FFA Week, are the members of the Minot chapter of the FFA. They'll be leading us in today's pledge.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands,
one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And in honor of National FFA Week, I do have a proclamation here to read for the FFA students here with us. City of Minot Mayor proclaims February 17th to the 24th as National FFA Week. Whereas FFA and agriculture education provide a strong foundation for youth of America and the future of food, fiber, and natural resource systems. And whereas FFA promotes premier leadership, personal growth, and career success among its members. And whereas agricultural education and FFA ensure a steady supply of young professionals to meet the growing needs in science, business, and technology of agriculture. And whereas the FFA motto, learning to do, doing to learn, earning to live, and living to serve, gives direction and purpose to these students who take an active role in succeeding in agriculture education. And whereas FFA promotes citizenship, volunteerism, patriotism, and cooperation, and FFA members are future farmers, chemists, veterinarians, government officials, bankers, business leaders, teachers, and premier professionals in many career fields. Now, therefore, do I, Tom Ross, Mayor of Minot, hereby proclaim February 17th to the 24th, 2024 as National FFA Week in Minot, and encourage all residents to recognize and appreciate the efforts made by FFA to change the lives and prepare its members for leadership, personal growth, and career success through agriculture education, and to thank the FFA members and its members discover and develop their talents through hands-on experiences that lead to real-world successes. So I'll have the FFA members come on up and I'll present. Oh, excellent. Okay. A lot of breath. And I do have one more proclamation to read. Minot Mayor proclaims February 18th to the 24th as Engineers Week. Whereas engineers use their scientific and technology knowledge and skills in creative and innovative ways to fulfill society's needs. And whereas engineers face the major technological challenges of our time, from rebuilding cities devastated by natural disaster, cleaning up the environment, and assuring safe, sustainable, and cost-effective infrastructure is designed and constructed to meet the needs of society. And whereas engineers are encouraging our young math science students to realize the practical power of their knowledge, and whereas we look more than ever to engineers and their knowledge and skills to meet the challenges of the 21st century. Now, therefore, do I, Tom Ross, Mayor of Minot, hereby proclaim February 18th to the 24th, 2024 as Engineers Week in Minot in recognition of the important past work and future contributions provided by engineers within our community and their vital role in creating safe, reliable infrastructure for the city of Minot and its residents. I'll get this to you, Lance. Unless you want to come up for a picture. Okay. I don't know if that was a dig against me or you just didn't want to be in front of Just a brief, a few items on the meeting list that I had. We had the Visit Minot Stakeholders meeting this week. Also, the status between the last two meetings here. The State of the City. I also participated in the planning of a suicide symposium that'll happen this fall on the campus of Minot State University. Alcohol Ordinance Review Committee. Spoke to the employees at Aspire Credit Union. Workforce Academy ribbon cutting. We had a Home for the Holidays planning meeting for next year. Task Force 21, Workforce Development Committee with the Minot Chamber, and an event at MSU, the MSU Democracy Cafe. So those were the meetings. I do have one more thing I wish to give a shout out to, and that's Minot native Mason Morelli, who appeared in his first NHL professional hockey game last night, in fact, scored a goal and an assist. So Mason, if you're watching, which I doubt it, congratulations and good luck. Keep up the hard work, and you're making all of Minot proud. So if there are any questions or comments, if not, we can move on to the city manager's report.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. The city manager memo is prepared and available in the packet for you and the public. Be happy to answer any questions at this time if there are any.
Are there any questions of our city manager? If not, we will move on to item number 5, that is consider the report to the Planning Commission. And item 5.1, major subdivision preliminary plat, Avery second edition. What are the wishes of the council?
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, Mark.
Recommendation.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? Any further discussion? If not, please call the roll.
Janser,
Yes.
Olson,
Yes.
Bittner,
Yes.
Padragula,
Yes.
Ross,
Yes.
Burlingame,
Yes.
Evans. Yes.
Moving on to item number 6 on the agenda, that's our consent items. We have 25 items on our consent agenda. None of the council members have asked any of them to be pulled. So now is the time, if there's any that wish to be pulled, to make it known. Last call. If not, what are the wishes of the council?
Move approval.
We have a motion by Paul. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Lisa. Any discussion? Any discussion? Seeing none, please call the roll.
Bittner,
Yes.
Padragula.
Yes.
Ross. Burlingame,
Yes.
Evans. Yes. Janser,
Yes.
Olson.
Yes.
That moves us on to item number 7 on our agenda. That's our action item, 7.1, amendments to TIF District 2022-1. What are the wishes of the council?
Move approval.
We have a motion by Paul. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Lisa. Discussion. Brian.
Good afternoon, Mayor Ross and members of the council. For your consideration this evening are amendments to TIF District 2022-1, which is the Big M building. The applicant for this project is Big M Minot LLC, represented by Todd Burning and Blake Nybakken of Epic. They're requesting to make modifications to their development agreement and urban renewal and development plan. They want to add additional commercial square footage to the building and reduce the amount of residential square footage. The TIF district was approved by the City Council in June of 2022. The building's redevelopment plan approved commercial square footage on the 2 lowest levels, market rate apartment units on floors 3 through 6, and condominium units on floors 7 and 8. The TIF district was used to fund asbestos and interior demolition costs. According to Big M Minot LLC, the cost for this work came in higher than anticipated. Big M Minot LLC completed the asbestos remediation last year. They now want to amend their redevelopment plan to add commercial usage to the 3rd, 4th, and 5th floors of the building. The 6th, 7th, and 8th floors will be used for market rate apartments, and then they're going to be dropping their plans for the condominium units in the building. The amendments proposed by Big M Minot LLC will not impact the financial figures of the TIF district. The TIF district was approved for 20 years at a 90-10 split, meaning 90% of the increment would go towards the retiring the bond debt, and the 10% would go to the taxing bodies. The county actually approved the TIF district for 8 years at 100%. The amendments will not impact the minimum assessment agreement that was approved between the city council and Big M Minot LLC. The agreement stipulated that Big M Minot LLC and their successors would have to pay property taxes at a minimum of $14.1 million while the TIF district is active. This ensures that there'll be enough revenue coming in over a 20-year period to retire the bond debt. Adding more commercial space to the building should be able to help retire that bond debt at a quicker pace. And representatives from EPIC are available in teams tonight. They're here to answer your questions if you have any.
Are there any questions? Any questions? Thank you, Brian. Any further discussion? Seeing none, please call the roll.
Pittner,
Yes.
Padragula,
Yes.
Ross,
Yes.
Burlingame,
Yes.
Evans,
Yes.
Janser,
Yes.
Olson.
Yes.
Motion approved. Moving on to item 7.2, M&S concessions for the Trax bid winner of the alcohol license, second extension. What are the wishes of the council?
I'd move approval.
We have a motion by Lisa. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mark. Discussion. Paul?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd just ask, can the applicant maybe just answer some questions, maybe give some background as this is our second extension, looking at another year?
Good evening, Mayor Ross and council members. Do you have any particular questions, or I can just kind of tell you where we're at?
You maybe just pull the microphone, or adjust it, because,
Better? Better?
oh, yeah.
Much better.
For me, at
Okay,
least.
my name is Jeff Singer. I'm the general manager of M&S Concessions. We purchased this liquor license with intentions of opening a bar at the Trax Plaza in the Maverick building. We're leasing the space, and as we sit, the space isn't completed. So our first extension, I believe, comes up in April 1, and it's very clear we're not going to be done. The building's not going to be done. So I did talk to the contractor. What I've heard is it's being finished now. They're starting on the top, working their way down, so they're working on apartments. So right now, the bottom level where our space would go is a catch-all. That's where sheetrock and everything is, and as they go down, they expect occupancy July 1, which is when we could start. So I asked for the extension a year out. Certainly don't think it will take that long. Once we can start fit up in July of this year, we'll move forward. We're ready to go. But right now, we don't have the space. I do have plans if anyone would like to see them.
Do you want to?
Sure, if you got plans for us, we'll take a look.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions? Any other questions for Jeff? Any questions? Thank you, Jeff.
I don't have a question for Jeff, I just have a comment.
Go ahead, Lisa. Floor
So
is yours.
if my memory is suiting me well, this liquor license was one of the 2 additional liquor licenses that were added, is that true? 4 additional liquor licenses. And at this point, do we have anyone on a waiting list that's wishing to have a liquor license and they can't because we're at capacity?
I have been contacted by one person about a retail liquor, beer, and wine license. I don't know if that contact understands the value of that license. It's for Corbett Field. They were hoping to add to what they were going to be selling this summer for the games, and I just had to let them know that those are capped licenses, and that's one that's not an option. And I gave them the ordinances for the other licenses that are available if they felt something would work with their business plan. I don't think they I never got in the discussion of how much the initial cost of one of those is.
Okay, thank you. And again, as I recall, when we added these liquor licenses, we had the same number of businesses interested as we had liquor licenses available. It wasn't that we had to prioritize or that there were, the highest bidder received some and some did not. So I can be very comfortable in offering the extension. I certainly hope that construction goes well and that they're able to get open, because it's not really commonplace to offer these extensions, but I do feel comfortable with it at this time.
Thank you, Lisa. Any other comments? Questions, comments, discussion?
So I'll just briefly note for the council's benefit here, section 5-32 of Minot City Ordinances addresses when the council has the power to suspend or revoke a license. And one of the reasons that you could suspend or revoke a license is if the licensee does not conduct the activity for which the license was issued at the licensed premises for a period of 12 consecutive months. To move forward with any such hearing like that, though, you would have to give notice to the applicant that you intend to hold that hearing, and they have the opportunity to be heard on that as well. So just wanted to present that information to the council.
Thank you, Steph. Paul?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I guess that's my point as well. I mean, we've gone through this before with a previous license that wasn't in use for almost a calendar year, and then the business opened up for 3 days and reset their clock. Again, it's new construction, it's construction delays, labor force delays. I don't want to punish someone or be punitive for those reasons, but again, I think it is, again, the mayor alluded to his participation in it. I'm also chair of the ordinance review committee, the alcohol license ordinance review committee, so I think this is something that will be looked at deeper at that level. I'm comfortable granting the extension due to the circumstances, but I think it is something that needs to be addressed as to when these licenses, whether from the idea of whether they're a capped license or whether it's what's ground for it being revoked or suspended. So again, I don't want to be punitive for something that's potentially out of someone's control, but again, it is an asset that we value in the city of Minot through the capping of these. So I want it to be very clear as to the reasons and the reasoning behind granting an extension. So.
Thank you, Paul. Any other comments? Seeing none, please call the roll.
Olson.
Yes.
Pittner.
Yes.
Patrickula. Yes. Ross.
Yes.
Burlingame.
Yes.
Evans.
Yes.
Janser.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Moving on to item number 8 on the agenda, and that is personal appearances. Now is an opportunity for those who wish to address the council to step forward to the podium to speak. I would ask that for the respect out of others who wish to speak, if you keep your comments to limited to 5 minutes. Thank you.
At the last city council meeting, February 5th, Lance Mayer said that he stands by his words on ADA compliance, that as far as he knows, they are in compliance on accessibility, and the inspection team is top-notch. While there are council members that acknowledge that we can do better, the city staff does not. This table is an example of Lance Mayer, the city engineer and project manager of City Hall, standing by his knowledge on ADA compliance and inspections. It reminds me of segregation, pictures of separate water fountains with signs above each, one saying white and the other colored, distinctly different in the standards and how each were perceived. While you have upgraded and positioned this table since the last city council meeting from what would compare to a styrofoam cup to a glass, this is not real progress. If this table were set up in the same way as the white lectern to the left, designed by the architects and the project manager, Lance Mayer, I would share that picture of the fountains that would pull at your heart. This table pales in comparison to what segregation and integration was like, but absolutely parallels the isolation that segregation was in the adversity of integration. What a disappointment that this building is completed less than a year ago in April 2023. This table is as egregious as the north door entrance not having met ADA compliance for occupancy and the attitude of the city to call it a sidewalk complaint. Lance said they were not looking for ADA compliance for the threshold for a door that an ADA push button was added to and going to ADA restrooms provided for by the city. He said that this threshold was not part of the inspection because the sidewalk was the issue. Several buildings on Main Street using the downtown facade improvement program provided for by the city modified the sidewalk to meet ADA compliance. City Hall to be the example, the catalyst downtown. It did not meet the same ADA requirements. Perhaps the city should use the architects and have a different project manager if this is the best that the city has to offer for City Hall. I would like to recommend a third-party contractor for ADA compliance on inspections. April 2023, Stephen Padracula stated that the design standards for City Hall called for the building to be fully accessible. He stated that after talking to Harold Stewart that this is no single point person on issues having to do with accessibility, and that Lance Mayer, the chief engineer, comes the closest. Even though what can be fixed, it is the attitude of the city that assures me that ADA compliance will continue to be dismissed, that there is no integrity when no one is looking. Carrie Evans stated at the roundtable on issues impacting the disabled communities, October 2023, that the residents seeking a ratio of petitions should have looked at what is written rather than depending on the flunky that answered the phone and gave them the wrong information. I would ask that the city use the same recommendation on ADA compliance for architects, engineers, and inspections, and use a third-party contractor for quality assurance. When Harold Stewart addressed this in December 2023 at the City Council meeting, he did not acknowledge it as an ADA requirement, but rather he saw someone struggle to get over the threshold. ADA requirements are in place not to see the disabled struggled, to validate a need, but because the need has already been validated. This is the attitude of the city, and it's clear here that attitude reflects leadership. I'm sharing with you these comments and questions because I do have an expectation, and I'm confident that you can reach them. I ask that the city go back to the architects and get it right, the lectern, the design, and the completion to make it ADA compliant. I stand by what I said at the last meeting, requesting that there be training and requirements for ADA compliance to be met. Thank you. Are there any questions?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now is an opportunity for those who wish to address the council to step forward at this time.
All right, good evening, members of the Minot City Council. My name is Tim Bauman, and my purpose for speaking this evening is to share with you the results of a series of 5 community conversations and listening sessions held between November 13th through the 15th of 2023 on the topic of what's next for sustainability in Minot. The goal of this project was to engage Minot residents, business owners, organizations, and high school-age students to find out what they would like to see in our community moving forward around the topics of environmental sustainability. All sessions were free and open to the public and held in public spaces, with the exception of the 2 sessions that were held at Central Campus High School. Funding for this project was provided through my participation in the North Dakota Change Network and the Bush Foundation. To make this project equitable and non-biased, I worked with an independent facilitator from Bismarck named Ellen Duffy. Ellen uses a facilitation process called the Art of Hosting, which is outlined in the final summary that was emailed to all of you at the end of January and again yesterday. This document is by no means a scientific or statistical representation of the population of Minot, but rather a compilation of ideas and comments from over 250 residents over those 3 days. I was not involved in the process of summarizing the thoughts and words of our community members, and this document is available to the general public by emailing environmentminot@gmail.com. In hosting these 5 listening and conversation sessions, our facilitator focused on the following questions. What sustainable practices is Minot currently doing well, and what else would you like to see? What obstacles prevent us from adopting sustainable practices in our lives? And the third question is, in an ideal future, what would you envision Minot to be like for yourself, your children, your grandchildren, and everyone who calls home? You can read through the responses to each individual question in this report. Although the conversations began around the topic of environmental sustainability, I found it interesting how broader community values and goals were woven into the responses. In summation of all responses, the facilitator wrote, and I think we're going to have this up on the screen, it is page 12. Through these conversations, it is apparent that Minot residents are community-minded. The main themes in the provided data set highlight a vision for an improved and sustainable community in Minot. Some of the key areas include enhancing education on sustainability, establishing communal spaces for collaboration and activities, promoting open-mindedness, eliminating stereotypes, and increasing support for families. There is a strong emphasis on reducing dependency on single-car transportation, improving river quality, and access and enhancing green spaces, especially downtown and in the floodplains. The community spoke and envisioned a city with a soul, emphasizing pride of space and community placemaking. Sustainability efforts include waste management through composting and recycling, architectural material exchange, increased renewable energy, and a robust local food model. The data also supports affordable housing, better public transit, diverse and inclusive communities, and initiatives to end poverty. Additional features include walkable neighborhoods, pedestrian bridges, local food restaurants, indigenous environmental connections, and winter placemaking. The community envisions a future where everyone has equal rights, childcare is accessible, and there are resources for rehabilitation and support for all those in need. Overall, the vision is centered on creating a vibrant, inclusive, and sustainable community for all. So thank you for your time to listen to me share these results. I appreciate those who were able to participate in the event in November, both to share your thoughts and then also to listen to members of the community. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them now.
Are there any questions? Scott?
Tim, thank you so much for coming tonight. Couple of questions. Did you, in your data, see any significant differences between the high school kids that you interviewed and the adults? I mean, what are the kind of trends that we're seeing in our youth?
Yeah, so to clarify, I was not the person who processed all of the raw data that was collected, but I was at all of the listening sessions, and I can say that one thing in particular that the high school students were really speaking about was winter placemaking, a place to come together, the idea of more community accessing, more community spaces for young people, especially in that 15 to 18-year-old age range, where maybe you don't have to buy a product or purchase something in order to be in a space.
Okay, and then I know when I looked at your longer report, one of the things that came up was like, with increased and better public transportation, and one of the things that I saw in there too was bus stops. If you want to talk maybe, what was the thought around bus stops? Do you have any memories of that? Is that process when we don't really have bus stops in town? Should we? Is that something we should look at? Is that something the community should invest in a little bit more? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, thank you. More than anything, I think bus stops represent a visual reminder of the fact that there is public transit and this is the route that is run. I think that even signage would be a good step in the right direction for letting folks know where the different routes run, where you can meet them. I feel very comfortable riding the bus, and I ride it on the regular as we're a one-car family. But I did go a pretty deep dive into figuring out how all of that is, and I know that there are other community members who don't feel as confident flagging down a bus on a busy road. So that is kind of the idea, the visibility and also the accessibility and comfort level with riding transit.
What was the biggest surprise you had in this process? Was there anything that really kind of just came across as different than maybe what you would have expected when you began the process?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, all of the conversations were really started out with the idea of environmental sustainability, and I thought it was very interesting that one of the ideas that really floated to the top in all of the conversations had to do with food security, housing security, equity. Just all of those things were very clearly occurring and on people's minds at a very deep level, regardless of age, regardless of background. Those were things that they wanted to see in the community. Those were very high priorities for them.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Steve?
Just a comment, I wanted to compliment you and your group for going through this process. I was a participant in one of the meetings, and it was a very eye-opening experience, particularly in terms of the diversity of people that were there, especially younger people. And I think it was a very well done and very thorough look at that part of our community. And some of the things that were proposed have already been implemented. For example, we do have a bus going out to the new hospital complex. So it was good to see some ratification of what we've already done and decided on. Many of the other things that were talked about are things that have been circulating among city leadership. So again, it was good to see people saying, hey, this is what we want, this makes sense to us as a community, kind of ratifying our judgment. I was also struck by the fact that a lot of it wasn't simply a discussion of recycling or sustainability in a narrow sense, but sustainability in a broader sense of a community spirit. I think you used the expression of a community with soul. I was really impressed by that, and I think when we open our eyes and look at the broader community, we see a lot of people interested in those kinds of issues, interested in developing more openness and more diversity. I note that one of the recommendations talked about creating a shared community for more people to work together, and that included things like embracing diversity, welcoming an inclusive community, tolerance and openness, connection and pride of space, community placemaking, paying it forward with other opportunities for people who come after us, creating a culture with shared values, and I think it was nicely summarized by the expression city with soul. So I think really the report and the work has much broader implications, and I think helps ratify some of the things that many of us, or some of us at least, have been pushing for and seeing as important in the community. So it was nice to hear that. And again, I think the process was excellent. It took time. We had an impartial outsider kind of help facilitate this. We had small groups working together in different places, different times. They were broadly representative of the community. So I think it was a job well done, and I think it can be a model for similar kinds of explorations into different parts of our community and what we should be working on. So thank you.
Any other comments? If not, thank you, Tim. Thank you for taking the lead on this.
Yeah, welcome. Thank you.
We are still on action item number 8, personal appearances. Now is an opportunity for those who wish to address the council to step forward. Seeing none, we will move on to action item 9, miscellaneous and discussion items. Item 9.1, the ADA discussion, and I'll turn that over to Harold.
Yes, good evening. As you recall, late last year, after some conversation about ADA accessibility, in particular with the downtown facade improvement program, those kinds of things, council had directed city staff to come back with some research and some potential alternatives and recommendations. Included is a report that staff has worked together to prepare to provide some resources to the council and the public with regards to these matters. But before I get into that report specifically and some of its recommendations, one of the other things I was trying to do was to try to bring in some outside experts to address some of these concerns that have been voiced. Particularly, we tried to find someone from the federal government to talk about federal requirements and the act itself and what's required versus recommended. We have not been able to solidify somebody to do that yet at this point. We also wanted someone from the state that was an expert with regards to state ADA requirements to come and address the council and the public with regards to that. And we have not been able to identify anyone to do that as of yet. The final component was with regards to how ADA compliance, particularly with federal law, is addressed within the building codes that the city adopts and enforces with regards to the construction of new new buildings, new facilities, or the remodel of existing facilities. Staff has been able to line up Ms. Kimberly Parlberg, who is here from the International Code Council, and she's got a brief presentation for the council and public and be available to answer any questions for the council. So I'd like to turn the time over to her, and then once council has satisfied all their questions, then we can talk about the report that staff has prepared.
Kimberly, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. My name is Kim Prallberg. I work for the International Code Council, and I am a senior staff architect for the International Code Council. I've worked for them since 2000 when the three model codes merged. And while I concentrate on architecture and structural engineering and building code requirements, my personal background is my stepfather, David, has been using a wheelchair for my entire life, and most of my family are special education teachers, so I'm also an advocate. But tonight I was hoping I could give you a short presentation on a little bit about the difference between the building code and the federal rules and what applies, and what your code officials, mainly Luke Toma, can enforce versus some of the federal requirements that are enforced in a different manner. So if I can show you a PowerPoint presentation that I think will take maybe 10 minutes, is that okay with you?
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's see if I can get my thing to work here. Okay, so you guys the state of North Dakota adopted the 2021 building codes back in January of last year. And so basically new construction does have to be accessible, and there's a lot of rules there, but I understand that most of your concerns right now are dealing with existing buildings and alterations, so that's what I'm going to concentrate on. So when a lot of people talk about the built environment, they primarily focus on people that use wheelchairs, but the building code tries to include a lot of different aspects. For example, people with hearing impairments benefit from the requirements for visible alarms for emergency evacuation. There's also requirements in large assembly spaces for information to appear both on the Jumbotron in text as well as being broadcast. We have a lot of provisions for people with vision impairments in the building code. Protruding objects is a really good example. The requirements for handrails on stairs have a lot to do with people having ability to figure out where the stairways start and stop. A lot of the provisions and the technical criteria are based on technical information provided to us through different research projects for people that use manual and motorized wheelchairs. But we're also talking about temporary disabilities. Can also be for children. We have children provisions. If you don't have to design for children specifically, but if you choose to, how do you design for children with disabilities? And also the population that's aging in place. So people using walkers, canes, and some of the new technical criteria that we have in the IBC is based on people that use the motorized scooters. So really, we don't want to talk about disability today as much as we want to talk about the ability of everybody to be able to participate in your community. So the philosophy of the building code starts out that everything has to be accessible, and then we allow for a degree of inaccessibility that's logical and reasonable, but that has to be based on statistical information and research that we've done. So a really good example would be take the parking lot out in front of City Hall. If you started out with it, everything had to be accessible, you would assume that every parking space had to be accessible. But what we did is we went to the Department of Transportation, found out how many people had the accessible license plates. We went to AMA, how many people have the medical tags, and given that number with the stuff on the road, that's where you came up with approximately 2% of the parking spaces having to be accessible. Then how many people use converted vans? That's the 1 out of 6. So we do have statistical information and research behind the requirements. And how we get there is that the scoping requirements, the what, where, and how many, is when you use the building code. And the technical criteria, the how-to, is when you use the A117.1. Now, the A117.1 standard comes out approximately every 5 years. The building codes come out approximately every 3 years. So the advantage of using the building code is that we can come up with new technology, new information, new data, and get that into the building code. For example, the 2017 included a very big study that was done by Dr. Steinfeld out of the University of New York that gave us a lot of new information on the sizes needed for motorized wheelchairs and scooters, because historically, the ADA and the fair housing were based on a study that was done at the University of Illinois, where the study's far enough back that it was based on manual wheelchairs only. So other examples of new things that we have, the building code has stuff for EV charging stations. The next edition of the building code is going to include criteria for assisted toilet and bathing, which is necessary in nursing homes where people aren't strong enough to do self-transfer. Adult changing tables for parents that have children that might have some additional sanitation needs that can't self-transfer. So we're expanding and improving as we move forward. We're also trying to make sure that we coordinate with federal requirements. So we try to coordinate with the Architectural Barriers Act, the Rehabilitation Act, Section 504, the American with Disabilities Act, and the Fair Housing Act. So I spend a lot of my time talking to the federal offices to make sure that our criteria either meets or exceeds their requirements. So the ADA is a civil rights law against discrimination for people with disabilities. It basically has 5 parts or titles, and how they create the requirements for the built environment is done with a document called the 2010 ADA Standard for Accessible Design, and that's applicable for new construction and existing construction starting March 15th of 2012. Now, that's when DOJ adopted this standard. Basically, though, most of the criteria in here was developed before the year 2000. So it's about 25 years old now. So that's why using the building code can actually help provide better access. We're also trying to match the Fair Housing Act, which in 1968 was against discrimination in housing. But in 1988, it was amended to include people with disabilities and how they provide their built environment for all housing built after March 13, 1991, was using a document called the Fair Housing Accessibility Guidelines. Now, they only apply to new construction. Given a house that's built in 1990, or an apartment built in 1991 is kind of old now, but they only apply to new construction. One of the things, again, that the building code did to improve accessibility is that if somebody does a major renovation in an apartment building, we do ask for units that are similar to the Fair Housing Act in an existing building. And one of the things that ICC is very proud of is we've worked enough with Fair Housing and HUD, Housing and Urban Development, that we are considered a safe harbor for complying with the Fair Housing Act. In other words, you can design in accordance with the building code and the A117.1 and not have to go back to Fair Housing and see, what's more restrictive, what's different, because they realize that their criteria was mostly written in the 80s and it's so out of date that the new technology and information in the A117.1 actually exceeds their rules. Now, those are federal laws and they're civil rights laws, so they can address operational issues, meeting conduct, hiring and firing practices. The building code, though, is really set with the built environment, and the code officials can go in to enforce the locally adopted building code and state amendments. But they can't enforce the federal rules. Basically, Department of Justice doesn't want us to enforce the ADA and the Fair Housing Act. We are enforcing accessibility through the building code process, but we are not expected or permitted to comply with the ADA and the Fair Housing Act. So that's a little bit of difference between a civil rights law and the state law that adopts the state and local building code. So that's a common misstatement because a lot of people take a look at the requirements for accessibility and just use everything to say, hey, that's ADA. So it's really kind of the difference that I'd like to explain today. Now, the existing buildings, we talk about the maintenance, alterations, change of occupancy, additions, and historic buildings. And again, we do our best to make sure that we meet or exceed the federal requirements. So while under the ADA, you can be asked for barrier removal or to look at making services accessible. The building code doesn't have a mandatory retrofit. Basically, if somebody applies for an alteration, then you can ask for some additional criteria at that point. But the code official just can't go to different building owners and say, hey, you have to make this accessible. So it really happens when you improve something. So basically, if you touch something, you fix it. So if somebody goes in and puts in a new tenant in an existing building and builds a new bathroom, that bathroom has to be fully compliant. But the bathroom down the hall, that may or may not have to be part of the project. And I'll explain how it's a little bit different. Maintenance and repair, basically if something is constructed accessible, it has to be maintained accessible. This particular picture is a city hall that I went to look at where they were altering the entrance. So they built a temporary ramp at another door until they were able to complete their work on the accessible entrance. If you're repairing a building over time, an existing building is not ever required to exceed new construction. So if this hotel would do the first floor and provide accessible rooms, and they go to the second floor, if they've got the right number of accessible rooms, the second project doesn't have to add additional criteria. So extent of application does say existing buildings should be approaching as much as they can to new construction, but they're not required to exceed new construction. Additions do have to comply with new construction. So if somebody adds onto a building, anything in that addition does have to meet new construction requirements. And if the addition relies on toilet rooms or the route through the existing building to get to that space, then they would be held to the same provisions to make improvements to the accessible routes. Change of occupancy, basically like a mercantile changes to a business or vice versa, they're treated the same as an alteration. So basically whatever you touch, you fix. And then there's some allowances for existing buildings. Because there's a lot of unique criteria for emergency evacuation, accessible means of egress are not required to be added in an existing building. Basically, for many decades, the fire service has used the fire and safety evacuation plans, and they prefer to stay with that policy rather than work towards full accessibility like you do in an existing building for getting into the building. There's allowances for technical and feasibility, which is movement of a major structural element or site constraints. So for example, you talked about your downtown today. When you did your facade changes, if the sidewalk was narrow enough or it's owned by the city, so it's not really possible for the building, the store owners to use that sidewalk to adjust to a change in elevation, it's technically infeasible for them to raise that sidewalk. Now, if you have a wide sidewalk, some cities have shared sidewalk programs that can get in place, but there can be allowances for technical and feasibility. Could be because you're right on the public sidewalk, could be because you're on a floodplain and there's some special rules like that, or you can't make your bathrooms larger because you're in between your stair tower and your elevator shaft and you can't move those. So that's kind of the idea of technical and feasibility. There's also a special allowance for historic buildings. If the alteration is going to destroy the historical significance or adversely affect it, historic buildings do have an advantage that they can have some additional, a little bit of leeway. And then I mentioned before, fair housing only applies to new construction. The building code does ask that if you're doing a major alteration to a housing apartment complex, that you do provide the fair housing or the type B units in that housing development. So here's just an example of technical and feasibility. This is actually the main public library in Philadelphia. And you can see with the columns and their steps, they're right on the public sidewalk. They can't raise the public sidewalk because then people couldn't park on the sidewalk and get their doors open. So they've provided an accessible entrance at a different location because it was technically infeasible to alter their front of their building. So again, movement of a major structural element or existing physical or site constraints. Now, there are special allowances in existing buildings just because of, if you built it new, you probably would do it a lot different, but there's special allowances for entrances, allowances for elevators to remain the size they are. If the shaft is too small, to enlarge them, to use a platform lift instead of an elevator. When you add stairs and escalators, there's a requirement that your accessible route should be in the same general area as the circulation path. But if you're adding a stairway someplace else in the building, maybe you can make your accessible route there because you're cutting in the floor, so you only have to do that in one place. Ramps, if you're dealing with an existing building, if you're less than 6 inches, you can go a little bit steeper than normal. I already mentioned the dwelling units and sleeping units. Bathrooms are something where basically, if it's technically infeasible, then you have some options for bathrooms, dressing room and fitting rooms, amusement rides. A platform lift is just an example. It is permitted anywhere in existing buildings, but in new construction, it's limited to where it can be used because a lot of times, especially if you're within small buildings, putting a incline platform lift like that top picture to go up and down the stairs is pretty much your only alteration option because you don't have the ability to cut into the floor. The elevators, or the platform lift safety standard does limit that to a maximum 14-foot rise. Or another example would be toilet rooms where it's technically infeasible to alter the existing rooms to comply. You can make them comply as much as you can, but then there's an option of providing a single accessible toilet room in the same area. So it's kind of do what you can, and then we're going to ask you to make improvements someplace else. There is something called a family assisted use toilet room. That's basically in large facilities with 6 or more water closets. They're expecting a large number of families, or it was also put in there to help people that needed assistance with an opposite sex attendant. You have a family assisted use bathroom. In new construction, it starts with 6 or more water closets required. In an existing building, we ask you to add that when you're improving your bathrooms if you're adding a fixture. But it doesn't ask you to reconfigure your bathrooms to get that. So that's the first part. The second part of existing buildings is as long as you're there, this is your best time to make improvements to the accessible route to the area you're altering. So it's trying not to have you go all over the building if you're talking about a multi-tenant space or something like that. But the route to where you're working, and then the bathrooms and drinking fountains that serve that area have to be altered. So if there's a primary function area, then you want that route there. And the definition for primary function area does match with what's required in the American with Disabilities Act. Like I said, we spend a lot of time making sure we try and meet or exceed their rules. If your bathrooms, route, and drinking fountains are all there and accessible, then you don't have to make any additional improvements. But if they're not, you look at that primary function area is a major activity for what the facility is intended. They do have in the definition, both in the federal rules and in the building code, spaces that are not primary function areas. For example, if you're just altering an entrance or you're just altering a restroom, whatever you touch, you fix, but it's not going to ask for additional improvements to the building because they're not considered primary function spaces under the federal rules or under the building code. And then there's, so that you don't break the project, because it's really stressing that we want to make sure we can encourage facilities to have a reuse of existing buildings in all towns, that the cost of the accessible route should not exceed 20% of the cost of the alteration. And that 20% is based on looking at federal court cases when ADA first came out in the early 90s, where people would say, well, you should have made improvements to the route. The average for what they asked for people to do was about 20%. So that's in the ADA and it's also in the building code. There is an exception for items that don't alter the physical configuration and the use of the space, if that's the only thing they're doing. Like if somebody is going in and just adding a sprinkler system, or somebody is going in and just replacing windows, then that won't kick in the extra money spent for the accessible route. But it has to be limited to those. If you're doing that as part of the general project, then that would fall into the 20%. Or if you're doing an alteration just to improve accessibility, like if somebody goes in and says, well, I want to rebuild my front counter so that I can have better access, because they're doing that to improve accessibility, you're not asking them to spend additional criteria or additional money for making improvements to that route. Or because we exceed fair housing, if the route is only to type B dwelling units that are being added as part of that existing building alteration, then fair housing never asked for improvements to the route. So being consistent with fair housing, we're also not asking for that. So the accessible route includes a lot of different things. It includes the parking, the exterior accessible routes or sidewalks. It can include your entrance, once you get inside, how do you get throughout the building, could be your elevator. And then it also includes the toilet rooms and drinking fountains that serve that area. And it can also include signage. So like if your existing building has some entrances that are not accessible, then you have to have signage telling people where they can go to find the accessible entrance. And then just again, the route improvements are limited to the area that you're altering so that you're not going all over the building. So I'll use an example of a school. If I'm going into the school and changing the principal's office for security in the kindergarten classrooms, being moved out away from the front of the building, which is a very common school reconfiguration right now, the route and improvements are made to those areas, including the bathrooms and drinking fountains, and they spend till they get them accessible or until they've spent their 20%. But if they get done and they have money left over, I'm not going to ask them to go and make improvements in the sixth grade wing. You're trying to limit it to the area that you're altering and improving. It's trying to find a reasonable level for where you can ask for accessibility to be improved. So, for example, it's also designer's choice for where they want to put in that money. Because, for example, I might say I've got $1,000 project, so I have $200. That might get me a new lever knob on the front door, or it might get me a new grab bar in the bathroom, but it wouldn't do anything to say, oh, well, you have to go spend that on the ramp that doesn't exist yet, but the only thing you're going to get with $200 is maybe a footing. So they ask designers to try and pick where it's going to make improvements across the board for everybody as much as possible. So just a quick example, in new buildings, 60% of public entrances are required to be accessible. And one of the new improvements in the building code in the 2021 that you'll see is that in some larger buildings, those public entrances also have to have automatic door openers. But in existing buildings, you're asked to make improvements to the route, but it's not going to ask for 60% of the entrances. It's going to ask for you to have at least one accessible entrance, and that a route be provided from that entrance to the areas being altered in the space. You could end up getting more than one entrance in a building if that's the route they choose to make the improvement to, but it's not necessarily going to get you more than one entrance on a mandatory insistence. And that is consistent with both the federal rules and the building code. And like I mentioned before, historic buildings do get a little bit more of a break. If they're certified by the State Historic Preservation, the National Registration, Historic Places, or they're capable of being certified, they're designated as historic under applicable state or local laws, then the idea is that historic buildings can also use the argument that I can't put a ramp up to the front of this historic home because it would involve ripping off the porch, and that's what the historic significance is. So if it's determined that it's going to be detrimental to historic significance, then you are allowed to have some additional limitations. The picture here is actually a mansion in Galveston, Texas, that's been made into a museum. They do have an accessible entrance, but it's actually next to these steps and over to the side, because historic building, if you took these particular steps off or tried to create a ramp on this very steep site, then it would destroy the historic significance of this particular facility. So there's allowances for site arrival points. You only have to provide access to the main level. It can be an alternative entrance as long as it's monitored. And you don't have to fix all the bathrooms. You only have to provide an accessible unisex bathroom on the main floor. So that's kind of trying to explain the difference between options that are available in the building code versus the federal rules. And here's some technical assistance that I hope will be helpful to people. The first phone number and website up there is the International Building Code. We do the building code and also the accessibility standard. And then the U.S. Access Board is the second phone number. They're great for answering questions about the ADA and the operational or hiring, firing practice aspects. City site, not building sites, your communication, telecommunication, what's available on your website would be some stuff that aren't part of the built environment, so the Access Board could be a resource for that. There's also 10 regional ADA centers around the United States that are very, very helpful. They know the state people a lot, so that's also a great number if you need assistance. They also, because they're closer to everybody, are easier to get a hold of if you need to come and talk to you. And then the last phone number down there is Fair Housing First, which is the group that helps with issues with Fair Housing Act. So the building code will help get the building right, but Fair Housing First would be great to ask for. My condominium doesn't let me do an alteration that I need for my special needs. What are my options under the Fair Housing Act? So again, there's operational and after the fact adjustments that they can work with that the building code really can't. So I hope I didn't take too much of your time this evening. That's just a super quick overview. So that's all I have for you today. Does anybody have any questions or any concerns for what I brought up?
Yes, Steve. You have a
Thank
question?
you. It was a very informed presentation. I was wondering if you could send a copy of your PowerPoint to the city clerk so we can post it on our website.
I will post
I did send it yesterday.
I'm sorry, thank you.
Jennifer got it to me today.
Thank you. Go ahead, Steve.
A specific question, we've had some controversy about, our city hall has two public entrances, and one of them is accessible, the other hasn't been, and is in the process of being made accessible. In terms of that 60% rule, would both of those have to be accessible?
Was the town hall altered, existing, or is it brand new?
It was altered in a major way.
Okay, so brand new construction, 60% of public entrances. But with existing buildings, the idea is that you look for the entrance that's most closely related to the area you're altering. And you provide an accessible route all the way from parking to the sidewalk to the curb cuts to get to the front door and get into the building. So literally an existing building could have just one, depending on where you're altering and
The whole building was altered.
how you choose to do
markedly.
it. But you don't have to do all in an existing building or the 60% even.
But what if the whole building was altered?
But she meant like what the doors are, where they are in proximity to like the activity of City Hall. So like
Well-
the north door.
Everything was altered.
Okay, so if I'm doing a mall as an example, I might choose to make multiple entrances accessible because the tenant on the south side fixed it this year and the tenant on the north side fixed it last year. But literally, they could both head for the same entrance. In an existing building, a minimum of one is expected to be made accessible, but there's nothing requiring you to do more than that. Now, a city
Bathroom
might
and
choose
entrance.
to make both accessible because maybe the north entrance was closest to the parking and the south entrance is closest to public transportation. But that would be exceeding minimum code requirements.
As long as there's an accessible pathway to the
Yes.
major use areas from the
Right.
accessible entrance. Okay, thank you. That clarifies it.
So if I may.
Go ahead.
So for example, this was an old bank building, so it was an existing building. So it falls underneath the existing building code compliance. Even though we altered every floor and ripped out just about every wall in here, the building and its structure itself was existing prior, so it falls underneath the existing. What city staff tried to do was provide as much accessibility as possible to this building. So the main entrance, the main path of accessibility is through the south door. So we made improvements to that to make sure that it was fully accessible, and then to provide access to all the public areas within the building. We put in the new elevator here that you can see through the windows of the council chambers that goes up and provides equal access to all facilities, all floors within the building. So through the south door and that elevator, there is accessibility to the entire public space within this building. City staff tried to go above and beyond by also making the north entrance door accessible, which we're working on making additional improvements. We have the temporary fix and then the long term, but by building code, because we have the south door that is accessible and in combination with the elevator, this building is fully accessible without the north entrance. But we're trying to go above and beyond by providing to make sure that the second entrance is also handicap accessible.
Thank you, Harold. Any other questions? Steve?
Yeah, you mentioned in passing that the new code requires electrically assisted doors or activated doors. What do you see?
Not all buildings, it's certain occupancies over a certain size.
Okay. What's coming down the pike? I guess my concern is I obviously want to have, as in terms of my own values, as much accessible as possible, as easily accessible as possible. But I'm wondering, in terms of prioritizing this, one of the proposals that we've been presented is the idea of, or at least another city in North Dakota has funding available to retrofit, to give funds to retrofit businesses and other organizations. And I'm wondering, in the broader scheme of accessibility, how does that rank? I mean, are there going to be things coming down the pike besides automatic doors that, we need to be aware of and maybe budgeting for? I hate to kind of spend the money on something if there are going to be more important things coming up, or if there are more important things to the disability community as a whole.
Well, some of the new technologies that are out there and available, like what's coming up in the next edition of the code, is a lot more information on EV parking stations, how to make those accessible for people. And a lot of cities are choosing to add EV parking stations in their public parking lots. Right now, you can put an automatic door opener on an exterior door if you don't have the maneuvering clearance, so that somebody can open it manually as an option. But if you're making improvements to the route, surely adding an automatic door for an exterior door would also be something that could count towards that 20% to make improvements. I live near the city of Indianapolis, and we actually have what we call a shared sidewalk program, where they have places in the city where the sidewalk's wide enough that they can build a raised sidewalk portion in front of the stores to help people get access into the stores, because the buildings are old enough that they're all up a step from the sidewalk. But there's other parts of town where that isn't an option, because maybe the sidewalk's only 6 feet wide. And if you took that much away to provide access, then you wouldn't be able to use the sidewalk or have people park on the street and get their doors open, or you're talking about drainage and utilities and all kinds of stuff that the city's dealing with across the entire downtown area. So it depends a lot on what your availability is. Some of the new information on public sidewalks and streets that's coming from the Department of Transportation through a document called the Public Rights of Way does allow for streets and sidewalks to slope with grade if it's controlled by the street. I don't know how many hills you guys have, but San Francisco really benefits from the advantages of that. They put in some options for accessible parking spaces, that if you don't have a wide enough sidewalk to offer street parking with a transfer space, that you locate that next to the corner so somebody can get out of their car and get up on the curb cut immediately. So there's some stuff that you guys are probably dealing with, the public streets and sidewalks, which might be a little bit different than the built environment as far as an actual building construction.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Scott?
I have a quick question. I am much more familiar with the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act than I am IBC standards. Obviously, when you look at the ADA, which hasn't been updated since 2010, and fair housing since 1988, they haven't been updated by Congress, but they've been updated by lawsuits. And so new standards come out, new recommendations come out based on lawsuits. How much does that happen with IBC? Is it, or is that different because IBC isn't a human rights law in the way that those other two are?
Well, typically as new technologies come forward, the ICC holds public hearings. And so like the EV charging stations, we're working with the US Access Board to make sure that our technical criteria and their guidance document that they just put out is consistent. So through our public hearing process, which the proposals were submitted in January, we're going to have public hearings in April. We'll have a second public hearing in October. That will move forward into the next edition of the building code. So if we don't really have lawsuits against us as much as people want to bring new information technology improvements to the building code, and we can do that through our open hearing process because anybody can participate. Actually, I'm one of the few people in the United States who can't write a code change because I work for ICC, but anybody else could. That's one of the reasons the automatic doors got in, is because some people took a look at, when you have high winds coming from a different direction or exterior doors that are sealed because of, energy code concerns, that's really tough for some people to open. Some things like grocery stores and hospitals provide automatic doors, but maybe some buildings don't. So they took a look at what buildings they thought needed to have them, and they put in a proposal to have public entrances have an automatic door opener, and that was accepted through the building code process. So we continually develop, we continually take advantage of new information to new technologies. We do watch the court cases. So if we see something that comes forward that's not commonly understood, we can address that. Something that's really easy, like if you look at the building code requirements for grab bars in a bathroom, because there was information from AARP saying that the horizontal grab bar found in ADA didn't help people that needed help standing up or sitting down. The IBC added a vertical grab bar as a requirement next to the toilet. So we also look for complaints, concerns that come forward through Department of Justice and Fair Housing and try to make improvements to address that.
Anything else, Scott? No, I'm good. Any other questions? Thank you, Kimberly, for your presentation. Thank you so much for sharing that information with us.
Sure, we're always available to have anybody ask any questions. We're always happy to help through your code development department or any way that you need us. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. Okay, now moving on to item 9.2 on the agenda, that is the lead and copper informational presentation. Jason. Before you start, was there any further discussion or comments on the presentation from Kimberly? Steve.
Yes, my question is, where do we go from here? The extensive and very good report staff submitted offered 3 different recommendations, and I'd like to see us, maybe if we need more time to mull this over, but I'd like to see us move toward adopting one or more of them.
I mean, ultimately tonight, the purpose was to provide information and discussion. I don't know that staff was anticipating council taking any action tonight, but we can definitely put it on a future agenda. There were a few points that I wanted to highlight in here that was not covered by the presenter because it wasn't her realm or expertise to do so. So first and foremost is in the ADA law, there's a couple different titles that address things, and this is outlined in the report. And that being that there's a Title II and a Title III. Title II being public services, local government, school districts, those kinds of things. So City Hall would fall underneath the Title II requirements. Title III is any other business that would provide public access, where the public is reasonably going to come in and access. That would be Title III. So your facade improvement program would fall underneath the Title III requirements. Title II, it says, this comes from the ada.gov website, which is, I believe, created by the Department of Justice with regards to ADA, who has the enforcement responsibility by the federal government. That's a simplification. There's some others that have enforcement responsibility with regards to ADA as well, but such as housing, that was referred to earlier. But in general, for Title II, with regards to this building, the ADA is meant to ensure that people with disabilities can fully participate in all aspects of civic life. Under Title II, all state, local governments must follow the ADA regardless of their size. Title II of the ADA requires state, local governments to give people with disabilities an equal opportunity to benefit from all of their programs, services, and activities. And then it states that we cannot deny people with disabilities the chance to participate or make them participate in different programs and available to others. So for example, in this room, when we designed this room, this podium here was designed specifically to go up and down and is designed specifically to go low enough for ADA compliance. Whether or not you want a different standard or not, but the ability to come in through the south door, the ability to come in through the doors to enter into this room, and ultimately the ability to come and speak to the council, the same as any other citizen, is all provided within this room. It's all accessible. That doesn't mean that we can't go above and beyond what's required, but this was intentionally designed to provide ADA accessibility so that any citizen, regardless of their disabilities, has the opportunity to come and participate in civic interactions within this building and access all of the services equally. I'll also note here that she referred to the technical advisory groups, the 10 different regions. City staff did reach out to our technical advisory region. That would be out of the office in Denver. They seem to focus more on Title III resources and help than they do Title II, so they weren't very helpful for us as far as addressing concerns with regards to this building specifically. We've been trying to find someone to come and do a walkthrough of this building specifically for ADA accessibility. We did do it prior to opening with Independence Incorporated. They brought in several of their clientele to walk through this building and gave us positive reviews, but we're fine with trying to find someone else to come in and re-verify that or not on whether or not we meet accessibility requirements. Things such as the podium versus a table and some of those kinds of things. So staff is making an effort to listen to what's being expressed in concern and addressing whether or not we need to make any changes or not, or whether what we have done is applicable and appropriate. Then going on to the facade improvement program, just a key highlight here. I did have the finance director and the city attorney's office look at state law and our ability to provide grant programs through taxpayer funds with regards to these. And we're pretty limited in what we can do. It either has to benefit the poor or be part of an economic development program or enterprise. The facade improvement program downtown is an economic development enterprise. It's directly supporting businesses. And we did allow through those guidelines for the reimbursement of ADA improvements to be eligible as part of that. But going outside of that facade improvement program and just creating an ADA accessible program, by North Dakota state law, we would not be able to do that because it does not meet the qualifications of poor or an economic development enterprise.
So TIF wouldn't qualify?
You could potentially work TIF in there or be a part of the TIF application. So for example, when we did the M building, we justified that the removal of asbestos and stuff was a financial limitation to that facility, and we allowed TIF. So if someone came forward and said that ADA compliance as part of the remodel of that building was a financial barrier to moving forward with that facility, then that could potentially qualify through the TIF revenues for reimbursement from the city as part of that. That could qualify on that direction. In addition, we became an entitlement community for CDBG purposes. We did have staff reach out to our CDBG and HUD representatives, and we could create an ADA program and fund it with those funds But again, staff encourages that we go through a full process on prioritization of how those funds could be used on behalf of the community and whether or not ADA accessibility is the highest, best use of those funds. I'm not saying it is or it isn't. I'm just saying that there is a process that we need to go through in order to verify that. But that is a possibility that funds could be used there. But I still believe it would be limited only to areas with regards and projects related to low to moderate income projects. We couldn't just do it for any business across the community. It'd be limited to those that service low to moderate income needs throughout the community.
I guess to cut to the chase, what I'd like to do is to request staff to put this on a future agenda for consideration and with recommendations. And what I'm particularly interested in, I don't know about the other 6 of us here at the table, but I'm particularly interested in looking toward what Mandan is doing in terms of mandating, or not mandating, in terms of, and mandating if people are taking public funds that they need to meet a higher standard of accessibility, particularly in terms of automatic doors, where it's feasible. I don't want to force anything down anybody's throat. And I very much agree with you that I don't want to set this aside and give it priority over any other programs. I think it should be considered with anything else. But I'm interested in having a discussion about it, giving the public a chance for input, and moving forward in some fashion. So if that could be put on the agenda, whatever.
Well, really,
time
it
you
can't,
need.
like, when you look at the recommendations, like, we can't, the really only recommendation that is actionable is the second recommendation.
Right.
Right, so that would be the.
Oh, we could do nothing.
Well, yeah, so we can put that on the agenda.
Right, that's what I'd like.
We can do that. Is change the city ordinance to be similar to the Mandan ordinance, and start with that.
Whatever is convenient for staff in terms of something to put on the table.
But we already
Steph?
have, right?
Steph?
She's attached the ordinance to this.
Yes, and so I was going to say, Mayor Tom, I might be putting our public information officer on the spot, but I'm plugged into Dias number 7, and I have municipal ordinance 111-2-9 of the Mandan Code up on my screen, if you want to share that for the council to just kind of review. It's not very long, but in some, it requires buildings open to public use that have received the benefit of public funds from the city to provide for the installation of an automatic door for at least one main entrance to the building. So it provides for a definition of public funds. That's in North Dakota Century Code. It's what you think it would be. I can pull up that code too if anybody wants to review that. And then it refers to what a public use is considered as well. It wouldn't apply to grants or awards of public funds to a recipient of less than $5,000. So it takes kind of those considerations that the International Building Code takes into consideration too. So just wanted to provide this for you for your reference. If you want to read through it, I can email that out as well, but I think it's also included in Harold's report too.
And
Could I ask Stephanie
you.
if you could
Carrie? Go.
write this as a proposed ordinance and put it on the next agenda?
I can do that. One point of clarification, though, is the discussion is stemmed around, do you want it inserted in the building code, or do you want it as a condition to the facade improvement program? I can present
we have
both
to.
options.
The recommendation is to leave the facade improvement alone, right? I don't think we're going to delve into that. So I think it needs to be standalone in the building code.
Okay, we can do that.
And Steve, what I'd like you to do too is to analyze to what extent we can make this a requirement for any program that obtains city funding. Harold has mentioned the facade improvement program. And I've asked about TIF, and the other big one I think is Renaissance Zone. So I guess what I'm wanting to see is if there are, what the limits are on that. I think you could make a case that Renaissance Zone is an economic development program. Maybe that's legal, maybe it's not. I'd like your opinion on that. I'd like your opinion as to how far we can extend it. I guess my conceptual way of looking at it is if you get public funds, you need to be maximally accessible.
That's what the Mandan. Can you bring that up again, Stephanie?
Yeah, and it's still on my screen.
No, it still is. Look at that first sentence when she brings it up.
It would be under subsection A, where it says restatement, every building open to public use that has received the benefit of public funds from the city. So
that would be
TIF
our
financing would be
That would
included in that.
include TIF, Renaissance
that's
Zone, and
public
facade
funds.
improvement.
Yep, any building that's received any benefit of public funds shall provide, and it's for the installation of an automatic door for at least one main entrance to the building. So it's not every entrance
Right.
to the building, it's just one takes into consideration the existing rules in the building code and ADA. So a lot of what our previous presenter contemplated too.
That's my intent then. The other question, I think this is more of a policy question, maybe more for budget time, but we've heard some input that this is desired, and I personally think it's a good thing. I don't know what Scott thinks, because he's also very much in the business of accessibility, what his professional opinion is. But it'd be nice if we could get some input from, if you will, the disability community, more individuals, not just with mobility impairments. But I guess I want to make sure we're not putting too many eggs in one basket. I mean, I think we need to look at accessibility broadly, as the consultant was saying. And I just want to be sure, I just want a second opinion in a sense from people with other forms of impairment, other forms of disability, and even those with mobility impairments. If this is worth the effort, this is worth the fight, or if there's some other things we should be looking at instead of this or ahead of this. And that's part of the reason, too, I guess, to be honest with you, I favored that Human Relations Committee. That seems like that would have been a very good vehicle by which to start talking about this, by, soliciting and hearing voices that we normally don't hear. So, I like the idea, but I just want to make sure that people are more directly impacted by it, have their say.
So let's not start the
Carrie?
game with making people doing an either or. Let's start with the, you know what I mean? We're capable of doing all of that, right? Starting with this issue and moving, on to, we can't start with it being either or. We're going to do physical mobility issue or hearing, right? Like, let's start with this, and then there is plenty more opportunities to do right by people experiencing disabilities in our city and what they have, what their needs are.
So that's good.
And I don't think that, finding out what that is should hold up this first step.
I think you're right, yeah. But I'd like to have that conversation, like hear those
Exactly, yeah.
voices.
Scott?
One thing that I would like to see, I don't know what the mechanism is for this, but Harold, within this report, talked about the disabled access tax credit. So there is federal tax credits available already for doing some of these changes. And far too often, in my experience, that's an afterthought rather than a proactive tool. So it's something where, after accessibility changes have been made, accountants figure it out and use it. I'd really like to see that be applied. I don't even know how to do it or what the right process is for that, but I'd like to see them taking advantage of that federal tax credit as well as any aspect of working with any of our funding. I just really like to see that. I mean, and that's any business earning less than $1 million or less than 30 employees. That's a large percentage of our small businesses in this community. So really just like to see that as, I don't know again what the mechanism is for doing that, but I think that is worth being explored.
Thank you, Scott. And we have Mrs. Parlberg still online with us. She has her hand raised. Would like to speak.
Thank you. I just wanted to bring up that a lot of times people that provide funding can ask for something that's an improvement to accessibility. And so you guys have the total option to do that, similar to your ordinance that you just read that said if you receive federal funding, you have to work on the entrance. But typically, you can't put additional criteria tied to funding in the building code because the code official doesn't ask, and I don't think he legally can ask where the money comes from. So somebody mentioned that you wanted to do that in the building code. I don't think that that's an option given the limit of the powers of the code official. Is they don't have the information on the funding. So I just wanted to bring that up because that's been a very common question in the code change process. And somebody else brought up Title II and Title III. We don't use Title II and Title III per se because there's been a lot of confusion about what that means, but we do have limitations. For example, vertical access. Government buildings can't use the exception for not having an elevator in a two-story building, so we address it without using Title II and Title III. We do cover that in the building code. Thank you.
Thank you. Carrie?
Can I just ask Stephanie, can you just find an appropriate place in the Minot Code of Ordinances for that provision?
Well, and I do have a question for the presenter, if she's still here. So I think this is shared on the screen if you can see it. This isn't in the city's code of ordinance. This is in a city just south of us. But it indicates that every building open to public use that has received the benefit of public funds from the city. So the city would know which organization it has it has delegated funds to, so it's just public funds from the city. Does that concern still exist in
No,
relation to
because
putting it in the-
that's not applying it to the code official to enforce it. It would be dependent on, you could probably provide that information to the code official if you knew it was a city-funded project. But typically that would be checked by the person who was giving them the money. The same way you would if you told them to make a program accessible. So typically the funding source checks for the extra stuff that they ask for.
Any other comments or questions? Discussion? Thank you again, Kimberly, for staying online this long with us.
Oh, it's been very interesting. Thank you for letting me participate.
If there's nothing further, we'll move on to item 9.2 on the agenda. That is the lead and copper informational presentation. Jason.
Good evening, members of council. Over the last few months, maybe some of you have seen on Facebook or some other places, we've been asking people to look at the makeup of their service line that comes into their house. So I just thought it's probably pertinent to come to council, give you some updates kind of on where we are, why we're doing this, and kind of where this is heading. So there's a thing in place called the lead and copper rule. It was put in place in 1991 by the EPA, basically just to protect public health and reduce lead exposure to people. So what they did in 91 is they reduced the action level from 50 parts per billion down to 15. They required annual testing of customer taps, and then we can't exceed the action level in more than 10% of our samples. So a city of about 50,000, we collect about 30 samples when we do a sample event, so we can't have more than 3 that exceed. And then common sources of lead in drinking water are lead pipes, the service lines that serve a house, and then brass and bronze faucets at one time were made with certain amounts of lead. So some of you may or may not remember, but Minot has had a little history with this rule. Back in 1997, we exceeded the action level. There's some debate as to what caused it. At that time, we had switched disinfectants. We went from straight chloramine to chloramination. There have been some other cities in the country that have had similar instances of exceeding the lead and copper level along with a disinfectant change. And then kind of at the same time, there was a change at the water plant to a different corrosion control product. And there's some theories that could have exacerbated the disinfection issue. So not exactly sure what caused it, but back then the staff went to work to try to fix it. So we were back in compliance by 1999. And basically, to get in compliance, at that time, we discontinued use of the Souris River. We needed a good, stable source of water. The Souris River during the spring, during runoff, can get extremely soft. During the summer, it can get extremely hard. So there's a really varying quality. So we wanted to run, slightly higher calcium levels. So we needed a standard baseline that we could run it. So we abandoned the Souris River at that time. We increased our sampling to try to get a handle on where this was happening and why it was happening. And then we switched to over the course of those 2 years, we used quite a few different products to varying success. And we landed on one that basically got us in compliance and has kind of held us there. We haven't seen any improvements. Every time we do a sample event, we still have a couple samples that test above the action level, but we haven't seen any improvements in those. So I'll get into that a little bit later. But and we've remained in compliance since the late 90s. So we've been put on reduced monitoring, so we pull samples every 3 years now. And then we've maintained the product that we use. It's a phosphate product. It's called tetrasodium pyrophosphate. It's NSF approved, and it's used in a drinking water system for corrosion control, or one of many phosphates that can be used in a drinking water system for corrosion control. So here's where some of the issues come in. That rule was published in the 90s, so now they're updating the rule. They've started this years ago. We've worked with other communities in the state. We've provided comment to the American Water Works Association, to the League of Cities on some of the issues that we see with the rule. So they've been contemplating those. But kind of some of the directions that they're heading is basically they want complete and total replacement of all lead service lines in the country within the next 10 years. I think there was about $11.5 billion worth of money in the infrastructure bill that's being used to back up some grants in the state. So it's going to be a pretty big lift at some point. So one of the first components of that is we need to complete a complete inventory of all service lines in the city of Minot. There will be some new sampling requirements. They call it the first and fifth liter. So right now, when we do a lead sample in a house, we tell the homeowner to let their water sit overnight for at least 6 hours. And then we want the first 1 liter sample from a tap in the morning after it's sat. Now they're going to do first and fifth. So now you'll pull the first, then you'll dump out the next 4 and grab the fifth. That's a sample that is fairly assured is coming directly from the service line and not from the plumbing in the house, so they can differentiate between the two. There'll be a lot of mandatory testing in all the schools, daycare facilities. And then the rule is going to establish a trigger level of 10 parts per billion, which is about 5 ppb below the action level. And this is going to trigger mandatory replacements. Alderman Padragula and I were discussing this afternoon when he called me, and I have 3% on the screen, and now I've read a couple different numbers, so it might be 10%, because if you do 3% per year, you're never going to get all of your lines replaced in 10 years. So I think that might be 10%, but I have a little extra homework to do there, but this is something that's all coming into play still. Then there'll be a lot of increased public notification as part of the program. So the expected final rule is expected to publish in late 2024 of this year. And then the rule wouldn't take effect for 3 years, so in 2027. We've been hearing that the final rule is going to be published for probably the better part of 2 years. So we still don't know if it's going to be published later this year, but the expectation is that it is. So maybe for starters, what is a lead service line? So this is a clear pic that kind of shows. So you've got the water main in the street, and the service line is just the water line that connects from the main into the house. The issue that we're going to have when we get into lead service line replacements is now you have a property line boundary. So the city of Minot is going to be responsible for lead and copper testing and replacement of service lines on private property of a private utility. The city does not own the service line into a house from the curb stop into the water meter. So there'll be some things for us to consider there as we go forward, we get into these. Lead service lines, if we use state revolving fund dollars through the state, we'll have, there's a 66% grant funded, but there'll still be the issue of the 34%. If we are mandated to get into somebody's house and replace a service line, generally going down the road of like a special assessment is probably not going to be, probably not going to find a compliant homeowner that is willing to let us in and then sign them up for a, potentially $1,000 bill or whatever it is. So we'll have to talk through these. My recommendation is probably that we do this just like we do water main replacement projects. And we work with the homeowners. We basically take over ownership, we replace it and turn it back to them. There's a lot of communities that are doing programs similar to that. But these will be things that we'll have to consider as we start getting more into this. This is a snapshot of a portal that we have where people can log on and they can indicate the material makeup. So red is lead, gray is unknown, blue is copper. So as you can see, lots of gray. We have about 16,000 service lines total. We still have about 8,265 unknowns. So with the EPA, we can submit this inventory. Anything that's an unknown is assumed to be lead. So where this becomes an issue is if we get into mandatory replacements. Now we're doing 10% of 8,000 instead of 10% of maybe it's only 1,000 actual lead lines that we have. So the inventory piece over the next couple of years is going to be pretty important for us to keep working through. Some of the identification, we've gone through a lot of public records. We have tie cards for just about every residence in town. We're asking homeowners to do the on-site visual. There can be some water testing where you can look for trace amounts of lead in samples. And then worst case scenario, we have to get into excavation where we have to dig at the curb stop and then look at the 2 service lines at that point. These are the different lines that people can come across when they look at them in their house. Lead is item number 1. It's pretty noticeable due to the kind of the bulged fittings where there's connections made. Iron, there's probably not, we haven't come across a lot of iron in the system, but copper, and then there is poly. So if anybody needs help identifying, we'd be more than welcome to come out and give them a hand. And just to show the difficulty in the excavation method, probably the first time in my life I ever wished I lived in Texas. So the simple that I show on the left, that's, in a lot of parts of the country, that's where their water meters are. They're right next to the street. They're under a cover about a foot deep. You can look in the hole and you can identify both materials on either side of the water meter. In Minot, we have we're lucky to get frost depths in excess of 4, 6, 8 feet. So everything is tried to be buried 8.5 feet deep. So the picture you see on the right, that's a guy down in the bottom of a trench box next to a service line. We can do these identifications without sending a man down there, so we shouldn't have to dig a hole of that magnitude, but they're still going to be 6 to 8.5 feet deep to try to identify these. And then the picture on the far right, that is actually a lead service line that transitions to a short piece of copper before the curb stop. So just to give you an idea of what we're looking at. This is kind of our timeline. A lot of the records review is mostly complete, and we're ongoing with a lot of the visual inspections in the homes. Then we'll have to submit our inventory to the DEQ by October of this year. Any lines that have been identified as copper, we're done. We don't have to do anything with those any further. Anything that's listed as other, we'll have to do some public notification later this year. And then beyond that, it'll be the monitoring and the replacement program that would probably start. So if the rule is delayed until 2027, our first year of compliance sampling would be in 2028. And then we would have our first round of mandatory replacements, if we hit the trigger level, would be in 2029. So we have time, which is a good thing. So we can work through these options of trying to identify some stuff. But it's still a big task in front of us. So our action plan, continue to research and monitor, and then continue trying to ID all these unknown service lines, whether that's through additional home inspections or if we have to go to excavation. Some of the SRF loans, they will pay 66% of lead identification projects. So we could hire a contractor to go around town and excavate and identify, and we can get grant funding for that. So that's something I'll be looking into. And then one of the things that we are going to do at the plant is we're going to switch corrosion control products. I just wanted to be upfront and let the council know. At this point, we don't expect that the product we're switching to is going to create, a worse issue than we already have. But there's always a possibility. We're going to go through a lot of changes here in the next couple of years in the city of Minot. We're going to go from what we've had as groundwater for the last, 100 years probably, and we're going to be transitioning to Lake Sakakawea water here in the next year and a half. So different water source, different chemistries, and all these things could have an effect. But these are all things that the state, it's going to trigger a lot of additional testing. We're going to have mandated lead testing when we switch source water. So we'll continue to work through all this, keep watching the product that we're switching to, see if our hope is that a different product will maybe lower some of these levels and get us below the trigger level. If we can get into the trigger level, then we can address the lead service line replacements kind of on our time schedule and according to our 10-year plan instead of having the mandatory and having to go through all these 8,000 unknowns, and we could be digging where there's not lead, so we just have to get our hands wrapped around that inventory a little bit better to give us an idea of what these replacements will look like. Right now, I think we currently have about 285 known lead service lines, so a lot less than 8,000. So we need to find what that number is between those two numbers, and it's a pretty wide range. And with that, I would just stop for questions. Like I said, I just wanted council to be aware of, as we're posting stuff on Facebook, why we're doing it, and we'll continue to do it, and you may see some projects come through to help us do identification. So just wanted you aware.
Carrie?
When, I didn't get a sense of when an excavation would be necessary. Like, won't an in-home inspection always lead to identification, or not always, and then you'd have to excavate?
Mayor Ross, Alderwoman Evans, so basically, there's two sides to a lead service line, the homeowner side and the city side. So we have to identify both sides. So if the homeowner identifies their side as being copper, there is a possibility that it's connected to a lead service line that the city put in back in the early 1900s. So we have to identify both sides of the curb stop. That's the issue.
So when citizens are telling you what they're seeing inside their home, that could be copper, but there could be lead from the home to the curb stop.
It still could be.
So how is excavation the only way we would know that, though? Because like as a homeowner, I can't see what's coming out of my home to the curb stop.
Right. So we have tracing capability. We can hook a tracer onto a curb stop, and that'll impart a current into the service line. So we can tell with a fairly high level of confidence, the difference between copper and lead. They're both conductive, but we can see a difference when we trace a lead line versus a copper line. The EPA currently says that that's not an acceptable way of identification, so we're working through that. The last I got from the state is the state said they're researching, and unfortunately, the EPA, when they're researching, they don't research quickly. It takes them quite a while to come out with kind of their final ruling on things. But that'll be one thing that we're kind of pushing for, is some different methods of identification than excavation, because it's a real pain.
So this past year, when, most of the neighborhoods by Job Corps were getting the water main replacements and the service lines were being dug up, were those, please tell me, those like contractors were doing IDs of the service lines?
Absolutely.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Okay, because that was, you know what I mean, like a few hundred homes that could, okay,
Yeah.
perfect.
Every year, we're doing some much larger scale water main replacement projects last year and now, and then this year, once we get our projects out for bid. So we're taking, probably in the neighborhood of 200 to 350 homes off the unknown list just by doing those projects. So that helps, but.
A little bit, right?
Yeah.
Lisa?
Thank you. So here, true confessions tonight. I have seen this on Facebook and I haven't looked because I made an assumption that I lived in a newer neighborhood with newer construction. Is there any kind of date in there where if your development or your home was built after a certain time, you're pretty confident that it's not a lead line?
Yes. Mayor Ross, Alderwoman Olson. So anything built after 1986 can be assumed to be copper. And I think I think that snapshot I showed of our portal with all the blue dots, I think those are indications of all the post-86 built houses. So I can look at yours and verify.
Thank you.
Ready.
Mark?
I would just encourage everybody to participate in the survey. After Jason and I talked the other day, I went and snapped a picture of mine, and it turned out that it's poly, so that was good. And my house was built in 1980, so I'm kind of right on the line there. But it's easy to snap a picture and upload it and help out a little bit. So
Thank you. Scott?
Have you talked to realtors at all? I mean, obviously, there aren't enough houses in town for sale, but there are houses for sale. Look to them as experts on this?
Mayor Ross, Alderman Burlingame, no, that's not a direction. You know, we've worked with the assessors and the building officials. They're in a lot of homes. So I think that they've been trying to get data for us. The realtors are one that I haven't. So that's one I can think of. Yeah, we can look into that.
Thank you, Scott. Any other questions, comments? Thank you, Jason.
Yeah, thank you.
That takes care of item 9.2 on the agenda. Let's move on to item number 10, liaison reports. Let's start with Steve.
Thank you, Mayor. A whole lot to report today. First of all, an announcement of something coming up on Thursday, the 29th of this month at 5:30 at the Public Library. There will be a presentation on how to run for office in North Dakota that's sponsored by the League of Women Voters Plum Valley chapter. They are just getting organized. League of Women Voters is much more active in other states, and they provide nonpartisan, non-biased information about the political process at some point in some places about candidates for public office. But here there'll be a presentation on the mechanics of if you want to run for any partisan or nonpartisan office. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in getting involved, to attend that program again on Thursday the 29th at 5:30 at the Public Library. In terms of other events I've been to, the Commission on Aging met last Friday for its monthly meeting. Things are going well. On March 27th, we will have the March for Meals event, whereby community leaders will be invited to tag along with and help deliver with volunteers Meals on Wheels. I've done that several times. It's a very informative kind of presentation, so I'd urge my brothers and sisters to do that. And if you're invited by the commission to join in, it's a very good program, and you get to see, firsthand the individuals who are benefiting from it. I attended the monthly meeting of the Emergency Resource Council. There was a fascinating presentation by our fire department on a gas incident that happened, a methane incident that happened, I think, in Upham, around Upham in October of last year. And there was a person drilling for water, and they hit this natural gas pocket, which released all this methane gas. And being the regional response team for hazardous materials, our firefighters were called out there, and they secured the scene, they measured things. And I guess the geology around this area, including Minot, is such that these pockets of methane exist all over the place, and you don't know where they are. And if you hit one, they're usually several hundred feet underground. If you hit one, you can have a release of methane, which obviously can be very explosive. So if you do water drilling in your backyard, be real careful. I was very impressed with the response that our fire department gave, both in terms of the team on site and also the resources they mobilized in the community to support that team. Again, another indication of how important our participation in these regional teams is, whether it's the SWAT team, a bomb squad, or in this case, the hazardous material team. I was very impressed by what they did and the support they received from the entire department. Carrie, maybe we'll talk about the Minot Ward County Planning Commission. Well, maybe not, because there's not a whole lot. And I had the privilege last Monday and Tuesday to participate in 6 hours of training sponsored by the American Association of Airport Executives. It was a video seminar for people in government to learn the basics of airport regulation, airport funding, things like that. Very, very technical, very detailed. A professor from UND's aviation school gave the presentation, and actually she's on sabbatical this year, and our airport director is teaching one of her classes at least. And it was a very, very educational activity, very technical. I should have taken some aspirin before parts of it, because it was dealing with federal regulations was very challenging. But so I know a lot more now about airports than I ever knew before, and if it's offered again, I would encourage people to participate, because we need to be aware of the importance that our airport and aviation plays for our community. And I think that was it in terms of formal liaison activities.
Thank you, Steve. Carrie?
Like Steve said, Ward County Planning Commission, nothing out of the ordinary there, and the library committee, nothing out of the ordinary. Children's library is remodeled and up and running. If you haven't taken a look, go take a look. It's gorgeous, and the kids are enjoying it. Yeah, that's about it.
Thank you, Carrie. Lisa?
Pretty quick report. Right after the last time that we made our reports, I attended the City County Park School Liaison Committee meeting, and we enjoyed an update from Dr. Vollmer, who was giving us updates in the construction process of Minot North High School. It will be a fantastic facility, and I think everyone's excited for the day that it'll open. Took part in the Central Dakota MPO meeting on the 25th. We have another one this Thursday. And just wanted to thank you, Mr. Mayor, and all of the city staff that put together the State of the City. I really enjoyed that and think that I'm proud that Minot does that, because we get to celebrate what happened in the previous year. Sometimes we kind of forget some of those details, and it's nice to be reminded of the things that have been accomplished and then to look forward to the future. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you. Scott?
The Child Care Committee did meet. We had Caleb Heilman gave a presentation about a new Montessori school that'll be going in near Minot State. It's actually kind of a cool collaboration between the Minot State Development Foundation and that private business. He's entering in on a 20-year lease to lease the land that it's going to be built on. And it'll have, several dozen spots available that'll help ease our childcare issue. Between now and the next meeting of our Child Care Committee, we're really working on coming and putting together reports that'll come to this committee or to this council and be able to kind of talk about all of the work that we've done over the last year and make some recommendations for you all moving forward. So, and I want to echo what Alderwoman Olson said, which is the State of the City. I definitely enjoyed that. I also think it was a great reminder of progress that has been made within our community. And I think that there's so much good being done, and oftentimes we can get stuck in the mud with some of the maybe negativity or the tough parts, but I think it's important to celebrate the good stuff as well, so.
Thank you, Scott. Mark?
Mr. Mayor, Lisa kind of covered the MPO and Liaison Committee, so I'm going to pass.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Renaissance Zone meets this week. Chair of the Alcohol Ordinance Review Committee met last Monday, meet next Monday. Slow process, but that's how the sausage is made. So we're working through that, and I think we have got some good feedback from some of the members of the community that have attended those meetings. Visit Minot, highlight some of the events. Obviously, State of the City was, Steph was able to present at that event, but this week we had firefighters convention, 800 firefighters, volleyball teams, 60 teams in Minot this weekend, basketball tournament. Next weekend, another big weekend, state girls basketball at the Dome, super regionals for Minot State Wrestling at the State Fair Center, the former Velva Youth Wrestling Tournament at the Auditorium, hockey at the Mesa, Rebel Gymnastics at Magic City Campus, Prairie Grit, and hockey is hosting Team USA and Team Canada sled hockey the following week. And another big announcement that Steph was able to share at the State of the City, but the Airstream RV Rally will be at the State Fairgrounds in August in 2026. Again, a big collaboration between a number of community partners, and Visit Minot kind of taking the lead on that, which very proud of securing that event. It's going to be 1,500 travel trailers in Minot for a week, boosting our economy, patronizing businesses and recreation in our community. So again, I know they'll be happy that they picked Minot and some of the good work being done.
Thank you, Paul. I also want to echo what Lisa, Scott, and everybody else has said about the State of the City. And it was, I heard many times it was the right message at the right time, but once again, it just doesn't get put together by myself. So Kayla, Anna, Brian, T, Jennifer, all in public information office. Harold, Minot State, the team at Minot State did an amazing job. So I just want to thank you. It's, we get to do this once a year, and the hard work that goes into it, I just kind of get to stand there and kind of reap the benefits a little bit, but there's a lot more hard work that goes into it than what people see. So I really appreciate the city staff for that helping out on that. It's a wonderful event. So, moving on to item number 11, adjournment. Is there a motion?
So moved.
We have a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned.